Alright, so we're on example 7. Leading coefficient that's not a 1. So we're going to move the constant to the right. You can either do one of those two steps in any order. You can either move the constant to the right and then divide, or you can divide and then move the constant. That really doesn't matter which order you do those two steps in. Okay, so we're going to divide by the leading coefficient so that we have x squared. That's going to give me two fractions. Okay, so I'm going to move the constant to the right-hand side, making it positive 21/4. Okay, so I'm going to do the little two steps. So I'm going to take half of the middle term. So half of negative 5/4 gives me negative 5/8, and then I'm going to take that number and square it. When you square a fraction, you square the numerator and the denominator. So that gives me a positive 25/64. Remember, it's the second number that I'm going to add to both sides. So plus 25/64 on the left. I'm going to go ahead and change 21/4 so that it has a common denominator. That's going to be kind of a big number. So 336/64 plus my 25/64. So we're going to factor the left-hand side. Now look at that trinomial, guys. And you would have to factor that. If you're not doing this two-step over here, that might be a nightmare. Do you see what I'm saying? But if you've done this two-step here, we know what goes in our factor. It's that number right there, x minus 5/8 squared. And then we have to add 336/64 plus 25/64 gives me 361/64. Take the square root of both sides. Plus minus 3 square root of 361 over square root of 64. And luckily, 361 is a perfect square. So x minus 5/8 is equal to plus or minus square root of 361 is 19, and square root of 64 is 8. So remember, when the radicals go away, that's when you're going to split the work. Okay, so I have x minus 5/8 equals positive 19/8, and x minus 5/8 equals negative 19/8. So x is going to equal 3. So add 5, 24/8 gives me 3. And over here I'm going to add 5/8. That's going to give me a fraction. It's going to be negative 14/8, which reduces. Always reduce your fractions. So that's going to give me a negative 7/4. Oops. Okay, so that's completing the square, solving by completing the square. Do you have any questions for me right now? Okay, we're going to do one more little thing. We're still completing the square, but what we're going to do here is, I don't know if you remember, but several weeks ago, we were talking about quadratics, and we learned how to take an equation that was in vertex form and change it into standard form. And at the time, I told you that we weren't going to learn how to go the other direction because we hadn't learned the skill we needed to do that. Well, here we are. You've just learned the skill that you need. So we're going to learn how to change an equation from standard form to vertex form. And you do that by completing the square. So just as a little reminder, right here, this is your vertex form. Y is equal to a times x minus h squared plus k, where hk is the vertex. So one of the things that's a little different, we are going to be completing the square. However, in this format, you will not be using both sides of the equal sign. All of your work is going to be on one side. And this is a skill that I want you to learn. So I'm going to insist that this is the way that you do this. Okay? We said earlier that you could do anything you wanted to, you just had to do the same thing to both sides. So when we added that number to the left, we had to add the same number to the right-hand side. Now, I don't want you working on both sides. I want you working on one side of the equal sign. So the left-hand side is going to stay Y the whole way down. It won't be anything else but Y all the way down. Okay? All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to group the x squared and the x term using parentheses. So we're just going to take and we're going to put parentheses around the x squared and the x term. Okay, so we didn't change the value. All we did was put some parentheses in there. Okay, didn't change anything. Now we're going to complete the square inside the parentheses. We're going to make a perfect square trinomial inside the parentheses. Okay? Now, when I do that, still going to have that little two-step thing we're going to do, okay? So I'm still going to take half of negative 10 gives me negative 5, and negative 5 squared gives me 25. So I'm going to add 25 inside the parentheses. Do you see? Okay, now when I add that 25 on the right-hand side, I have just knocked this equation out of balance. I have changed the right side, but I haven't changed the left side. So what we're going to do is, in order to rebalance the equation, whatever we do right here, we're going to do the opposite of that out here. So since I added 25 here, I subtract 25 here. Does that make sense? So now I'm back in balance. Do you see? All right, so next step, we're going to factor our perfect square trinomial, which means I'm going to use this number right here. So x minus 5 squared, and I'm going to add the numbers on the outside. So 22 minus 25 gives me negative 3. And you see that I now have vertex form. Okay, now we're going to do it where the leading coefficient was not a 1. Okay, so, but we're actually going to follow the same steps. However, we got to put an extra step in there. All right, so first step is the same. I'm going to put parentheses around the x squared and the x term, and I'm going to leave the constant outside of the parentheses. Okay, now we're going to complete the square inside the parentheses, but the leading coefficient is not a 1. Remember, we can't complete the square unless the leading coefficient is 1. But we're not going to be able to work on both sides. So what we're going to do is we are going to factor out the leading coefficient. Okay, now let me stop and say something to you here. You are not factoring out the greatest common factor. We are not pulling out an x. The only thing you're pulling out of that parentheses, that group, is the leading coefficient. Whatever it is, the leading coefficient is coming out. Doesn't matter if it's the greatest common factor or not. So y equals negative 2 coming out. Leaves me with x squared minus 4x. Because when I multiply that negative 2 back into these parentheses, I'm going to put a parenthesis right here for now so you see, whenever I multiply this back, I should get this right here. So you can check yourself as you go. Okay, so if I didn't change that sign, when I multiplied it, I'd get negative 8x. You see? All right. Now, I've got this plus 7 out here. Now, I really haven't changed anything to have to adjust this 7. I just factored out negative 2. All right, but now I need to create a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so we're going to use again, we use the x term here, this term right here. Okay, so half of negative 4 gives me negative 2, and negative 2 squared is 4. So, negative 2 times x squared minus 4x plus 4. Okay, now there's my plus 7 that I already had. But I knocked this side out of balance, didn't I? I changed the value. What do I need to do to rebalance it? And it's not minus 4. I didn't just add 4. It's negative 2 times 4. See, I didn't add 4. I actually subtracted 8. So I have to do the opposite of that on the outside to rebalance. I need you to understand the skill it takes to change and stay on one side. Okay? I don't do the same thing to both sides, but I have to offset whatever I do to keep it balanced. Alright, so y equals negative 2. I'm going to factor the perfect square trinomial, so that's going to be x minus 2 squared, and I'll add the numbers on the outside, which gives me plus 15, and I have vertex form. Okay, do you have any questions about that? Everybody good?